consider why we believe what we believe. And this is something I've only recently been thinking about. But I think there are three main factors, which are these three: intellectual reasons, personal reasons, and social reasons. And the proportions of contribution that each of those make to the overall reasons of what we believe is variable for different people. And so I've tried to put up some figures for myself. I think 50% of why I believe what I believe is for intellectual reasons, but there are contributions from personal factors and social factors as well. And maybe, for example, participating in an event like this contributes to the social factors of why we end up believing what we do. C.S. Lewis said these rather famous words: "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And among the personal factors that have influenced me from my youth, there have been two scientists in the church I was taken to by my parents when I was a youngster. And one was a man called Ewan Squires, who was he became one of the youngest professors in the country and moved to Durham for his chair, where he set up a theoretical particle physics group that's internationally renowned and still going on after his death. And in that photo, which I believe my dad took, I'm the shy boy on his left. Mm-hmm. And so I feel I am repaying a debt by being here. And this is one of the books that Ewan Squires wrote that is still in print from the Institute of Physics, The Mystery of the Quantum World. He wrote another book about, the trying to understand consciousness, which is one of the greatest problems around. Now, the God who we believe in, who is self-revealed in Scripture, is an infinite personal God. And I'd like to refer here to Psalm 103, starting at verse 13, that as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows how we are formed, he remembers that we are dust. And there is a further elaboration of that aspect, that we are dust. As for man, his days are like grass, he flourishes like a flower of the field. The wind blows over it and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more. Now it so happens this week, on Tuesday and Wednesday, I was at another conference of the Society of Biomaterials, and I was there by invitation to give a memorial lecture to a scientist who passed away in 2011. And I was thinking of these words then, because this is one of the great existential concerns of people, younger but also especially older people, when they meet in conferences, that will my work be remembered, or will it be forgotten, and will the new generation rise up and have, and it appear I might well as not lived. And of course that's a real thing, and the Bible here addresses that concern. It sort of faces up to mortality and the temporality of our earthly present existence. But it goes on to address that with one of the great buts in the Bible. But from everlasting to everlasting the Lord's love is with those who fear him. And it further says that the Lord has established his throne in heaven, his kingdom rules over all. So our eyes are lifted beyond our sort of personal navel-gazing concerns to think of God and of his sovereignty over the universe, his dominion over all. And we are reminded in the concluding verses of that psalm that we have a destiny to praise God. It was very good to hear Richard reading those words from the book of Revelation about the fact that the kings of the earth will bring their riches into the city of God. And I take it that that means that nothing that is good will be lost, that there will be the fruits of our labours which are not in vain in the Lord. So we have, despite mortality on the one hand, we have a destiny beyond this present life in the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. Now, this outlook, this biblical, this Christian outlook on scientific activity has, of course, as I'm sure you'll probably agree, been influential in the rise of what we know nowadays as modern science. And amongst numerous excellent authors, I take the example here of Peter Harrison, who was a professor in Oxford, and then he returned to his native Australia to head up the Centre for the History of European Discourses. And in these two excellent books that are mentioned there, he goes into great scholarly depth to establish his thesis. So we're here to think about the implications of Christian theism. And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean, firstly, absolute creation by God of a really existing but dependent universe. We mean that physical reality, what we can touch and see and detect with our senses and instruments, is somehow embedded in a spiritual reality, and not in any sense of pantheism or panentheism, and that human existence has a purpose and a destiny, as we've just been thinking. So when we think of the relationship between God and creation, then there is an imperfect analogy between an author like Shakespeare and one of his characters, Hamlet. So Hamlet has his own existence in the play under that name, and the total life and being of Hamlet has been created by Shakespeare. Another example is in the book by, various books by Dorothy Sayers, particularly expressed in this one, The Mind of the Maker. And she's mostly famous for writing detective stories where her protagonist was a certain Lord Peter Wimsey. But as Dorothy Sayers wrote a series of books about Lord Peter Wimsey, she thought, well, maybe he would like to have a romantic relationship and get married. And so she created in one of the stories a certain Harriet Vane, who met and they fell in love and they married. But the interesting thing about Harriet Vane, that she was really an alter ego of Dorothy Sayers. She was like one of the first women to graduate from, I think it was Oxford University. And so really she was effectively writing herself into the story. And this is what we believe, of course, God has done. That he is sovereign, in total charge of the whole fabric of space and time and our history. but also he has written himself into the narrative in the person of the Son of God. So I move on to key questions for a Christian academic, particularly in physical science, because that's my background. What kind of position should we be advocating? Well, if I'm asked in the pub or somewhere, what's your religion? I say I'm a Christian Trinitarian theist. And they probably think that means something like a Melanesian frog worshipper, but it gives me the opportunity to explain step by step, first of all, what a theist is, and what a Christian theist is, and a Trinitarian Christian theist is. But negatively, this is in competition with other worldviews in the marketplace of ideas, such as all this long list here of atheism and agnosticism, and sometimes ideas like pantheism and panentheism, to which writers on science and religion are at times attracted. But of course, the main alternative view is naturalism or materialism, as we find it in almost the default assumption in our modern places of education today in the United Kingdom, such as we are nothing but atoms and molecules, or we're some kind of cosmic accident of no final ultimate significance. And any meaning that we create for ourselves is only transient. And that's the sort of point of view of my Manchester colleague, Brian Cox, over on the left. And of course, Peter Atkins describes this in brutal and appalling honesty in his book on being. I had a bit of a radio debate with Peter Atkins, and later that week he was sat in my car and was driving him to the airport, and we got on quite well at the personal level because we had some things in common despite the polar opposition in religious outlook. But Peter Atkins is brutally honest from his position, and in many ways he represents what I would call genuine atheism, whereas a lot of what goes under atheism today I call atheism light. In other words, it's like a denial of various things that Christians and others believe, but it doesn't really face up to the proper implications. Now, in general, there are different kinds of explanation around. I've shown this slide in a number of courses on scientific method and so on, and students have often said to me how helpful they found this particular slide and piece of sort of information was. Because there are different kinds of explanation, that does not logically exclude another kind. For example, if the reason a kettle is boiling is because you want a cup of tea, that is a valid explanation. But of course it's not a scientific explanation. A scientific explanation would involve considerations of the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution of molecular velocities and of the effective temperature on that distribution, and why it is that molecules change from the liquid to the vapor state. But they're both valid explanations. This, of course, is a depiction of Plato on the left and Aristotle, his student, on the right, and Plato is pointing upwards to the kind of transcendental world, and Aristotle has his hand down, pointing to the earth and the importance of giving attention to the realities of, you might say, scientific study. And I suppose both emphases are appropriate. Now, I'm not assuming anything necessarily about your religious beliefs here, because very basically, if we think of God, humanity and the world, that we're aware of each other, we're aware of the world, irrespective, I hope, of or expect of our religious beliefs. But many people don't believe in a transcendental world. But before we come to biblical revelation about that, there are, of course, other factors and that point in that direction. And one of these is music. And these are some quotations from one of my favourite conductors, as well as favourite musicians, Sir John Eliot Gardiner, talking about Johann Sebastian Bach and his music, and the fact that, yes, music often, and there are different musical tastes, of course, but often that points us to something beyond the world of mere materialism. And as we know, Bach appended the initials SDG, Soli Deo Gloria, to the scores of his works when he'd finished, because he had a clear vision of what he was trying to do with his life. So, Christian Trinitarian theism, well, here's some might take me up for heresy or whatever, on purporting to have a slide explaining about God, but it's an attempt to represent centuries of Christian discussion in the early years of the Christian era, that we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, and the only Son of God, who's eternally begotten by the Father, and of the Holy Spirit, who is eternally proceeding. And these relationships, of course, indicate that within the Godhead there is complexity and diversity, but also a unity. And from a philosophical point of view, it's very interesting that unity and diversity are equally ultimate in the Holy Trinity. And when we think of God in relation to creation, again, each person of the triune Godhead is active in creation, as we say perhaps in the creeds, that God, the Father, the Almighty, is the maker of heaven and earth, that the Son of God is the one through whom all things were made, and we speak of the Spirit of God, who is the Lord, the giver of life. So we learn of this, of course, partly we begin to learn about this from the first verse in the Bible, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and that there is an absolute fundamental distinction between the Creator and the creation. Within the creation there is some differentiation, in particular the difference between heaven and earth, but they're both part of the creation. And it seems to me that there is actually, even in the church that confesses, I believe in God the Father Almighty, that there is a lot of confusion about what creation is. So I want to perhaps hammer home, really, or labour a point about the distinction between what I'm calling absolute and mediate creation, where absolute creation or primary creation is creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, and mediate or secondary creation follows in train from that, as I'll try and explain. But the distinction relates to whether we're talking about pre-existing matter or not. Because as Basil of Caesarea said, if matter were uncreated, then it would from the very first be of a rank equal to that of God and would deserve the same veneration. So, what do we mean by creation out of nothing? Well, or in particular, what is meant by nothing? Well, in Christian thought, this means without the aid of pre-existing materials, as is expressed in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3. But in some popularizations of modern cosmology, of scientific cosmology, nothing is used to disguise the actual assumption of various things. So, for example, a recent writer, Lawrence Krauss, who argues, he wrote a book saying the universe was created or the world was created from nothing. What he actually means by nothing when you dig down into it is that either there is a pre-existing structure of rationality, of mathematical laws, and in particular the concepts and realities of quantum fields and vacuum energies exist, and therefore his nothing is not really nothing as we mean it as Christians and as the Bible talks about creation from nothing. Now, immediate creation then is creation from existing substances, so once there is a world, a universe created out of nothing, absolute creation, then there is subsequent development, evolution, if you like or don't like, and change. And this, of course, is like the human activity of creative making. And in the book of Genesis, in chapter 2, we read of the creation of the first human beings, and that the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. So that is not ex nihilo creation. That is not absolute creation. That is creation from the dust of the ground. And of course the dust of the ground, and I'm happy to believe the dust of the ground is also stardust, was created by God in the ultimate beginning. But clearly this is, whatever dust specifically refers to, it is not nothing, it is something. And so this means that God is the first cause, has established and upholds secondary causes within the universe. So let's take another example. Here's a mountain. What mountain is this? The Matterhorn, absolutely. I've had the privilege of climbing Matterhorn and standing on the top. And when I got to the top, I was standing on Africa, because the Matterhorn, or the upper part of Matterhorn, the above, it's shaded here, and the yellow shaded part, the upper part from the shoulder on the Hornley Ridge, is an overthrust rocks from Africa when crustal plate moved into the European plate and thrust up the Alps. And therefore, when we say, and we can say truthfully to a young child, God made the mountains, but we have to understand, we're no longer children, we have to understand in a more sophisticated way that the way God made the mountains is by making them from materials and agencies that he previously brought into existence before there were any mountains. Now, this distinction between absolute and immediate creation is not an invention of mine. I'm quoting here from a classical Reformed theologian, Charles Hodge, in his Systematic Theology, who said that while it's ever been the doctrine of the Church that God created the universe out of nothing, yet it has been admitted that this is to be understood only of the original call of matter into existence. So theologians have distinguished between this immediate and immediate creation. The one was instantaneous, the other gradual. The one includes the idea precludes the idea of any pre-existing substances, and of cooperation. The other admits and implies both. So let's just think a little bit more about this in relation to time. Of course, this was one of the great insights of Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century, that he argued for creation with time, not as a physicist speaks of time zero, t equals naught. This is speaking, if this is cosmic time, this is speaking of the origin not merely of creation but of time also. And therefore there is no concept of a period intervening before creation. And these ideas of Augustine have enjoyed a new appreciation and popularity in relation to modern cosmology. And Paul Davies, in one of his books, writes a lot about that. But Alistair McGrath draws a lesson from this, which I think is very good, that Christian theology possesses resources which are relevant to new scientific debates. So also then, thinking of the universe as space and time, it's a case of a convergence between Christian thought, ancient Christian thought really, and modern scientific evidence and formulation. The physical time is an intrinsic or internal aspect of the universe, not something separate and in which the universe finds itself, which of course was the view of Sir Isaac Newton, that Sir Isaac Newton believed that there was a space and a time and just took those for granted, and within that God created the universe and the planets in their orbits and so on. So from that viewpoint, if you look at any cosmology textbook, there's two particular kinds of graph that you see frequently. The first is a space-time graph, where time is plotted vertically, and in this context, light, because it, in Einstein's view, travels at a finite speed, so light doesn't fill space totally immediately. It takes time, and therefore there's such a thing as a light cone. But the other kind of graph is of temperature against time, or actually the log of temperature against time, log time, and this means that as temperature decreases, or if temperature decreases, then increasing complexity becomes possible. Putting it the other way around, you can just think of the analogy of boiling water again, that if you raise the temperature, you start to split up water from being a homogeneous liquid mass into water molecules. If the temperature goes higher still, the atoms break down, the molecules break down into the constituent atoms, and then if you bash these atoms in the Great Hadron Collider at CERN in Geneva, then you break them down into their subatomic particles, and you can try and infer the existence of the Higgs boson and the quarks and so on. But as temperature drops, then complexity becomes possible. And so really, Christian thought about absolute creation at this point is that God creates one whole temporally extended universe from a stance outside space and time, because God is not limited to as a being within space and time. He's not confined to that. And so there is an unfolding of the universe created by God. But from a scientific point of view, for observers within the universe, there is a beginning of physical time. So it's the difference between God's perspective and ours. And as George Smoot, the famous astronomer, says, the right-hand picture here being a depiction of the map of the cosmic microwave background radiation, that there is, he says, no doubt that a parallel exists between the Big Bang as an event and the Christian notion of creation from nothing. Now, you might expect that given this sort of friendly relationship between cosmology and theology, the theologians will be falling over themselves to get involved and to dig into the biblical and historical theology insights about creation. But there are several reasons why creation has been neglected in modern theology. And I'll just go through this very, very quickly. There's been a focus on salvation history at the expense of nature. Biblical creation has said, oh well, that's really it's nothing. It's nothing of permanent importance because that's just based on ancient Near Eastern mythologies. Some creationist theories, not all, but some have engendered confusion amongst the theologians, so they've said, oh well, let's leave that to the scientists. It's a minefield, let's keep out of it. Deist and related perspectives have queried God's engagement with the world. Existentialism is man-centered. Liberal political liberation theology is focused on human beings and the concerns of human beings, which is good, but to the neglect of the non-human creation. And then in various churchmanships, there can be a very narrow theology of word and sacraments that focuses exclusively on human salvation, and equally, perhaps in other circles, a sort of pietistic withdrawal and focus exclusively on the spiritual and the otherworldly. And then amongst, perhaps particularly in America, there is the cataclysmic eschatologies of brands of dispensationalism, that if the world is going to blow up, well, why bother? And maybe, maybe that's why Donald Trump is in the White House, because there's a large number of people who believe the world's going to blow up anyway, so it might as well be Donald Trump who presses the button. And then generally, in a lot of churches, there's a downgrading of Old Testament preaching and teaching. And amongst a generation of Old Testament scholars, there was this sort of kind of macho emphasis on God's virile, mighty acts, such as the Exodus, to the neglect of perhaps the more calming themes of creation and blessing. Well, these are listed actually in this book by Terence Fretine, but I have personally encountered, I think, all or most of those in my life and mingling in different churches. Equally, there are some theologians who now are interested in creation. I'm not going to read this list out, and some of the names here are mentioned in the list of books that you'll find in, list of authors rather, that you will find in the welcome pack. So, moving on from that, there is an account of absolute creation by God. There is a divine imprint embedded in creation, a divine imprint of Logos. And it's not the imprint of any other force or power, but only God's imprint, because there is no other being to compare with the Lord, who, the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. And therefore, God has impressed his own rationality, which became incarnate in Jesus Christ, into the world. And this rationality, as we perceive it, as scientists, we imperfectly formulate as scientific laws of nature. So since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what is made. I put that quotation in my PhD thesis, in the preface, the sort of dedicated to my parents, and then I put that verse there, and my mother took a copy of my thesis round to her neighbour to show it, and this woman went out and bought a copy of the Bible immediately, just on that, for that reason. Actually, she was, well, I won't digress on who this woman was, but there's a story there. So nature, in the Christian view, has been divinized. There are not gods of the streams and different gods of the rivers, gods of the hills and gods of the plains. It's not like in Doctor Who, where there are various time lords that are warring and have their power over different parts of the universe. There is one Lord, the creator of heaven and earth. But the nature, the natural world, receives from God a relative autonomy, and a relative independence. So, sometimes we talk about theistic naturalism or methodological naturalism. Now, this is a controversial topic, and we might want to discuss this more in later. But what I'm meaning by it is that the created world really exists. It's endowed with these secondary powers subordinate to the underpinning primary power of God. And therefore we can look for natural explanations. We can look for explanations of phenomena ranging all the way from rainbows to reproduction. As we cleave by faith to God, who sustains, underpins, and is the goal of all existence. And our genuine but relative free agency is never, however, at the expense of divine sovereignty. Now, there are quite a few writers, and I'll be specific. For example, John Polkinghorne, who's a great guy, and he's written very interesting books. But he does tend, in my view, to incline to a position where if human beings have some freedom, this is at the expense of God's freedom. And I think that is a big mistake. So, because the issue of freedom or control is not a zero-sum game. So, there are various factors that are necessary for the world to, for science about the world, for science to be possible. And in particular, these depend upon the will of God. To quote from Revelation 4, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honour and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created, and have their being." So God made the world according to his own free decisions. Now, I can illustrate that by referring to a Manchester scientist that you've all heard of, James Joule, whose name is on every Kit Kat package that you buy as the unit of energy. And Joule was famous for the first law of thermodynamics, or the law of conservation of energy, and in particular the relationship between mechanical work and heat generated. So one aspect of the transformation of heat and energy. So we know that these bright lights up here are powered by electricity, electrical energy. They're converting the electrical into light energy, and they're also converting it into some heat energy. So there are interconversions, but as Joule says, as a result of the Creator's fire, which is of course a reference back to Genesis 1 and God's word, let there be. These, as he calls them, the grand agents of nature, are indestructible. And so that is the ultimate ontological reason why mechanical force and heat have a permanent, stable relationship. Now, I always like showing this illustration, which is of the phenomena such as sun, moon, stars, trees, and flowers and fields, etc., and a sort of shepherd boy or representative scientist who is not content with just gazing at the beauty of the world about him, but is gazing or trying to peer through the crystal spheres to perceive the hidden workings of the world, to understand the underlying causes and mechanisms. And that's what I take scientific activity to be about. And as we do that, we find that reality is stratified. And there's a whole list of things. I've put some more complex ones at the top and more small and tiny things at the bottom. And of course it's from the existence of these stratified layers that disciplines emerge. People come to specialise in a certain area or aspect. There's a gentleman called Alan Sokal that you may know of, who created a furore some years ago when he submitted a manuscript to a social science journal, which was a spoof, and it was called, it was a hoax article, but it was so full of impressive sounding jargon that it was published. And then of course, Alan Sokal, Frenchman, so Frenchmen would do that, wouldn't they? They said, hey, this was a spoof article, but anyway, he wrote another book, Beyond the Hoax, and he also says this: the physical universe has this hierarchical structure, and there are different theories corresponding to different laws. There are different theories corresponding to different levels, and there's such a thing as emergence as well as reduction. So I want to move on to consider that briefly. But just before I do, there's this, I think, interesting life experience from a Nobel Prize winner from Hungary, Albert Szent-Györgyi, who was, he got a Nobel Prize for physiology, but he wrote the following in his personal reminiscences. In my hunt for the secret of life, I started my research in histology, and satisfied by the information that cellular morphology could give me about life, I turned to physiology. Finding physiology too complex, I took up pharmacology. Still finding the situation too complicated, I turned to bacteriology. But bacteria were even too complex, so I descended to the molecular level, studying chemistry and physical chemistry. After 20 years' work, I was led to conclude that to understand life, we have to descend to the electronic level and the world of wave mechanics, quantum mechanics. But electrons are just electrons and have no life at all. Evidently, on the way, I had lost life. It had run out between my fingers. So I think that's a very profound admission. His reputation was already intact, so he could afford to make that. Now, this is another set of great scientists, Eugene Wigner, John von Neumann, and Rudolf Peierls, who but all agree that the reality of quantum mechanics implies the prior existence of mind. And I'd be very happy to elaborate on their argument for that, but time presses, so I must move on. And as a result of believing that there are really existent forces and agencies and entities that God has created, we can say yes, there are molecular driving forces. We don't sort of, well, it's not science to say, oh well, things happen, chemical reactions happen because God willed it. Well, God did will chemical reactions to happen, but that doesn't advance scientific understanding to say that. It may advance theological understanding or philosophical understanding, but we have to reckon with the real existence of things like enthalpy, entropy, and free energy, by which, for example, a polypeptide, sequence of amino acids linked together, will spontaneously fold into a structure. And this is happening in your bodies and mine billions of times a second. Well, perhaps not billions, maybe thousands of times a second anyway. These processes are going on. And there are molecular driving forces. And of course, we're all being educated about DNA as a kind of wonder molecule that is the language in which the genetic code is written that results in the production of cells and in the upbuilding of our bodies. But there's a dogmatism, a kind of genetic dogmatism called, which is a reductionist causal chain where genes, that is these sequences of DNA, they govern proteins, the proteins govern the pathways, and it all ends up. So everything, according to this view, is dependent upon the genes. But that's becoming a bit old-fashioned because there is such a thing. So, and as Dawkins said, we're nothing more than selfish genes. There's a thing called systems biology. And this is a very good introduction to it by the physiologist Dennis Noble, Biology Beyond Genes. And in systems biology, there is a recognition of both upward causation from the genetic inheritance and also downward causation, whereby proteins actually can also have an influence on the genes. Organisms can have an influence on the cells, and the higher level controls of gene expression. And indeed, this is part of a revolution, the epigenetics revolution, which which also envisages hereditable changes other than directly from DNA. Now, I need to move quickly so we don't go on too long. There's this quotation from Stephen Hawking, you probably know. What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes the universe for them to describe? Well, I'm moving back to this thought of scientific laws, and this quotation from Richard Feynman, that there is a rhythm and a pattern between the phenomena of nature which are not apparent to the eye, but only to the eye of analysis, and it's these rhythms and patterns that we call physical laws. Now, I have 2 or 3 slides that get just a little bit technical, so bear with me, but not long to go. So, consider the laws that, 2 types of laws that must be true, like non-contradiction logic. Something can't be both true and false at the same time. And like the fundamental theorem of arithmetic, every whole number can be factored in a unique way into primes. And contingent laws, which are mostly the laws that we encounter. That is, of patterns that might have been otherwise. So they tend to suggest a mind that has exercised choice at some stage. So if that is the case, then the laws don't have kind of some ultimate status, but only a derivative status. But at first glance, there do appear to be some blind laws that generate spontaneous order from disorder. And so we need to analyse this a bit more carefully with an example. And I'll take a physically simple example of packing of macroscopic spheres, such as marbles. So packing marbles, right? You have a container and you can shake the marbles around in it. And if you tilt them, then they will go into a hexagonal close pack. Now this, what I've shown here is a photograph which is, it's not necessarily quite as perfect as that, but they arrange themselves into a hexagonal close packing. And what is driving this? Well, superficially there's only two factors. One is gravity, and the other is mathematical necessity, because that's, in packing spheres, this is the best way to pack spheres, hexagonal close packing. And that's true as far as it goes, but there is an overlook point. And the general thing about this overlook point is that when natural processes are examined carefully, often there is an unfolding of an order that was already implicit in the nature of things. So what is it in this case? Now, if say you lived in a house with a movable floor, or you had a bedroom with a movable floor, we tilted the floor, all your stuff would fall to one end of the room, and it would be a jumbled heap. Why are the marbles different? They've got the same shape and size and mass, but also their particular shape has got a spherical symmetry. And that symmetry came from design. It wasn't a function of the mathematical laws of packing, nor of the physical laws like gravity that influence the way they move. And in general, we take order, we take too much for granted. And the order that is presupposed by a scientific explanation is often greater than the order it accounts for. So let's enlarge on this for this case. So now, if you think of a snowflake, which is a hexagon, then it has a certain kind of symmetry that in group theory is called the DH symmetry, 12-fold symmetry. But a perfect symmetry has a continuous symmetry, and a group theoretician, that's a mathematician, says it has, it belongs to the rotation group in 3D. Moreover, if we take 7 marbles, we can also permute them in different sequences, and you can have factorial 7 sequences, and therefore that number of symmetries. So when the marbles organize, symmetry is coming from greater symmetry, and some symmetry is lost. And this is what is called spontaneous symmetry breaking. So that is therefore a reason why, even in the packing the marbles, there is this other factor, the symmetry, the greater symmetry that they start with, that influences the way that they behave. I could stop in a moment, but is 5 minutes all right? There are a number of features about laws of nature that share remarkable affinities with those ascribed to the Christian God. And this is not me saying that, but Paul Davies, who's an author of many books on physics and cosmology. And so that when we see a law that applies permanently or applies universally, it's a reflection of the divine attributes. And this, of course, is not really a new idea. It's even older than the rise of Christianity, because people like Cicero expressed it. But you can look at a whole bunch of qualities of scientific laws, and you can pair them up with the attributes of God. And I'll move on. because that would take too time to go through that. But to take a few examples, in scientific discovery, we are learning stuff, but we're also finding new things that are unfathomed depths. And that should produce awe and worship in us. Again, we find that although, and this is the biography of Albert Einstein, called Subtle is the Lord, we find that the details of the world are very, very subtly arranged and are contra-intuitive. And then again, scientific laws are beautiful. And again, the Bible shows us a God who is profoundly beautiful. And there is a history of unification of the scientific laws, which is an outworking of the unity of heaven and earth that was recognized by the Christians in the early centuries, who protested against Aristotle, who had affirmed that the heavenly realm and the earthly realm were completely separate and obeyed different laws. And even in the 4th century, there were people who were criticizing that and saying, no, there is a unity of heaven and earth that we can expect, and which has been progressively discovered. As James Clerk Maxwell indicated in his statement on the Cavendish lab, and it's also there on the new Cavendish lab in Cambridge, that great are the works of the Lord, they're pondered by all those who delight in them. As also J.J. Thomson, who discovered the electron, said these words, that every advance in science shows how great are the works of the Lord. So, 2 more slides. One is a set of conclusions, sort of really brief points actually. The Christian Trinitarian theism entails belief in the origin of the space-time universe by absolute creation out of nothing. That God's creation has further aspects, immediate creation and so forth, that the Bible recognizes, and ex nihilo creation is fully consistent with scientific models within the space-time fabric, including, for example, Big Bang cosmology. And when we think, for example, of controversial areas like biological origins, the diverse views of what is happening or has happened in the area of media creation are fully consistent with firm belief in absolute creation by God. So lastly, and I just leave this on the screen, I'm not going to say anything about them, but these are some other headings that, I think that's all of them there, yeah, that we may wish to discuss if there's time to make. So thank you for your attention.